Hello, everybody, and welcome to TOEFL Masterclass Advanced Strategies for High Scores. And today we are here with Jane Birkenhead. She is an expert TOEFL teacher and manager of Birkenhead English. Her website is called birkenheadenglish.com, where she provides self-study courses and also very personalized TOEFL lessons for students. Jane, we're really happy that you're here with us today. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. Tell us, Jane, a little bit about how you started working with international students.
Well, I've been working with TOEFL students for the last 5 years. I really came into it by accident. I actually had a conversation with another TOEFL teacher, and that was really my path into exams preparation. But since I've been doing it, I have to say that I really love it. I love the contact with professionals from all over the world. And also the thing that I like the most is that every single student that I work with has completely different needs. So I always feel like I'm on a learning journey with them as I try and find out their weaknesses, their strengths, and then adapt whatever we're doing in lessons so that we take advantage of their strengths, we focus on their weaknesses, but we deal with the whole package of how they study, how they approach the exam, all that kind of thing. So I just, every time I work with someone, I feel like I'm learning something new, which is a really nice feeling.
Yes. Yeah, I always say teachers are learners. We just love learning. And in teaching is when you even learn maybe even more.
Yes.
So it is a journey that you take along with the student.
Yeah, definitely. And really, I just love it when students ask me questions that I don't necessarily have all the information for right away, because it means that I can go and find out more about that particular subject. And then I become more informed and then I can pass it on to them. But it's just all part of that kind of learning journey that you're always part of.
Yeah, you're so right. Yeah, it's so exciting when you get a question that you
Yes,
don't know. It
yes,
really is.
exactly.
Yeah. And I just love those cultural questions too, because when you're learning a language, you're actually studying the culture. So
Yes.
sometimes students will ask me, well, why do you say this? Or why is that a holiday? Or what are you doing there? And then I have to really consider why is it that we do that? And then that's when I learn something new. And all those cultural assumptions that we just take
Yes.
for granted all the time are called into question, which is really cool.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I've had experience of that moving from the UK to Canada. So even though I spoke English as a native UK English person, there were slight differences in just cultural applications of phrases and things like that. And certainly when I entered education here, because I did my master's here, I found that I actually had to learn a little bit of a new language in order to communicate with my classmates, my professors, and that sort of thing. So I definitely had that period of adjustment to go through in the way that other immigrants who aren't speakers of English have. And that was actually very enlightening. I realized that there were a huge amount of, well, not a huge amount, but a certain amount of cultural differences that just inform the language that you're speaking. So that was interesting.
Yes. And so helpful because then you can really relate to what students are going through in that learning process too.
Yeah, I hope
Really,
so.
yeah. I wasn't actually going to ask you this, but you made me think of the IELTS test. And do you have experience teaching the IELTS as well? And do you get students coming to you that are, maybe perhaps navigating both or trying to decide which test to take, which one's easier? A lot of students always ask this question. What
Mm.
are your thoughts on the IELTS test?
To be honest, I don't know a huge amount about it. I haven't actually taught it, although it's something that is definitely on my to-do list, because I realize that there's a huge amount of overlap. And certainly it's a lot of Commonwealth countries, or, sort of Australia, Canada, those kind of places that really favor it. So it kind of makes sense for me to know a little bit more about it. I haven't really investigated a lot about the differences, but I mean, all I know really is that both TOEFL and IELTS are recognized worldwide proficiency tests. So that means that they've had a lot of research carried out, a lot of input by people who monitor these things to make sure that their standards are the same. So I don't really buy the idea that one is easier than another. I think possibly because TOEFL is computer-based and IELTS is more, certainly in the speaking section, you have a conversation with somebody. I believe in the essay section, you handwrite the essays rather than type them. So they may be factors that influence which one you do decide to choose. But I don't think you can actually say that one is easier than another.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's the format, the way the test is presented that perhaps is a
Yes.
little bit more comfortable for students to access.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, definitely. I mean, I've worked with a lot of TOEFL students who've got real problems with typing. And it's one of those fundamental skills that if you're thinking about the typing that you're doing during the time that you're writing your essay, you're not thinking about the writing that you're doing because you're concentrating on the mechanics of typing. So it's things like that. There are certain skills that you definitely have to be comfortable with. And I mean, with IELTS, if you're not comfortable handwriting an essay, then that is also an issue. So I think it's a personal decision.
Yes. What would be some advice that you would give to a student who's really struggling? Maybe they've taken the test already several times, they haven't achieved their score yet, and they're kind of at that burnout phase where they're just totally tired, exhausted, done with TOEFL, ready to give up. What advice would you give?
Okay, so that probably is very typical of a lot of the students that I've worked with. And I think there are two sides to that, two sides to my answer. So the first side is that by an international professional getting to the point where they need a TOEFL score, they've done amazing things to get to that point. They are obviously highly educated and motivated and driven to succeed. So they should really congratulate themselves on actually getting to that point so far, because they've probably overcome quite a lot of hurdles. And, that is success in itself. And as far as the actual TOEFL side is concerned, it's not a mystery. There is going to be something in what they do that's preventing them from getting their score. And so it's a matter of being really analytical and discovering what that thing is. So it could well be that there's a particular skill, pronunciation, a way of tackling a certain reading question, something like that. It could be very, very specific. Quite often, and I've noticed this with students that tackle the test probably more regularly than I would like them to, but there is something within their exam strategy that's maybe preventing them from showing what they really can achieve. So it's a matter of finding out by using different methods what the thing is that's preventing them from achieving the score. It shouldn't be a mystery. It's a matter of being analytical and discovering what that is.
Yeah. Wonderful answer. It makes me makes me want to sign up for a lesson with you, because I can tell you're going to like target and pinpoint and just analyze, you know, how I'm approaching things and where I can do things better. So I love it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Um, so what is, and I know you take a every student is different. And so, you know, they're all coming to you at different levels and different strengths and weaknesses. But maybe in general, what would be one thing that students could do, maybe a change in their perception, their thinking or behavior, that would better position themselves for the TOEFL?
Okay, that's a really good question. And it's something that I've thought about a lot, because everyone is definitely individual. But at the same time, I think there is an overemphasis on the part of many students to jump into practice websites and continually practice old exam papers. And if I could change things just a little bit, I would get everybody ignoring those past papers, those past exams, until they're within a couple of weeks of actually tackling the exam themselves. And I would encourage people to build language proficiency, because TOEFL is a language proficiency exam. And sure, in question 1 in the speaking section, you're asked to answer a very specific question that you give your opinion in. But you can practice for that in so many different ways, not just by going and finding all the question 1s in the whole world and answering those. So I think focusing on being confident and comfortable communicating, whether that's speaking, writing, actively listening, reading, whatever, but working on all those things together, because then you can actually apply that to the exam situation. It's really difficult if you don't have good proficiency to go and enter the exam and get a high score.
Yes, I love that response, because it is really about fluency and flow. So if you're practicing in multiple different areas, and different ways of meeting that challenge, you're gonna sound more natural in speaking, sound more
Definitely.
natural in your writing. And I think these kind of robotic, you know, you get the robotic answer choice where everybody is
Yeah.
kind of saying the same exact
Yeah.
thing. And that causes a problem, because
Yes.
you know, you're no longer fluent if you're, you know, speaking like a robot. I know we got AI coming and all these gadgets and
Yeah.
things, but
Yeah.
I mean, after all, we're still human. There is still a
Yeah.
human grader somewhere on the other end of the TOEFL test evaluation side, the grading side. So we do
Yes.
have to sound like fluent English speakers.
Yes, absolutely. And there, I mean, there are just so many different ways that you can practice. Even if you're not actually living in a English speaking country, there are just so many fantastic resources that you can use. And I mean, it's something that I've worked a lot with students that have taken a few months to raise their level, because there's no way that we can keep looking at all the exam questions. That just gets really, really boring. And it's so much nicer to do other things that are still related. So, I mean, just very quickly, but one of the things I did with one student was for question 1, we just made up a load of really silly scenarios, and then she had to answer them very quickly. So one of the questions was, you are being chased by a big swarm of scary bees. Do you run into the forest? Do you run into the sea? Do you run into the deserted house in front of you? And so, you know, it's all things like that that just help to kind of build up your response rate, you know, your skill at just saying something.
Yes, I love that too. And being creative and a little silly, having fun with it, because that's going to activate a whole different part of the brain. A lot of times,
Definitely.
yeah, we're taking the test, we're super stressed out, and when we get in the stress mode, we don't have a lot of blood flowing to the prefrontal cortex where language is, where we can access vocabulary and ideas. And if we're so stressed out, we can't do that. But if we're having a little fun with things, all of a sudden, okay, we can bring that blood flow back, we can flow, we can remember vocabulary. And I think that's an awesome strategy. And unfortunately, I think a lot of students maybe are resistant to being a little more playful with their studies, because they think studying should be hard, or so we're kind of programmed to think this. But I love that approach of being creative, having a little fun with these things, because I think that's really necessary.
Yeah, I really like your explanation actually of what really goes on in the brain when we're experiencing stress, because I think a lot of people overlook that. You know, everyone thinks, oh, well, it's an exam. Of course, I'm going to be nervous. I'm going to be stressed. But there are lots of things that you can do to kind of, you know, kid yourself into the fact that you're not actually as stressed as you think you should be. And if you can get into that state, then you will perform well, definitely.
Yes. So Jane, tell us what you currently offer for TOEFL students right now.
So right now I work with students in one-to-one lessons, and the length of their lesson package really depends on what they need, what I think they need, you know, how much time they've got to commit to studying for TOEFL. But I prefer to work in lesson packages rather than individual lessons, because then I think I can support students better. So I can really tailor each lesson to what they need. But it's not just the hour that we're together in the lesson. I give lots of homework, lots of feedback on that homework. I suggest additional resources that they can use to do self-studying. You know, so it's sort of like I'm looking after everyone for the whole time that they're working with me. The other thing that I do, and I've really only just started doing this, so it's very much in development, but is using the techniques and the strategies that I teach in lessons and trying to translate that into online courses. You know, because I recognize that not everybody has either got the time or the inclination to actually be intensively with a teacher all the time. So I'm only really kind of like, you know, in the dipping myself into the shallow end with that. But it's something that I think, you know, with our current situation in the world, it's probably going to be much more important that there are a good variety of resources for people to use in online classes. I mean, in, you know, self-study classes, rather than actually being with a teacher all the time. So I've got a to-do list that's getting longer by the day, but hopefully by the summer I'll have a few more online offerings.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And tell us a little bit about your lesson for our webinar coming up.
Well, I've chosen to focus on listening. Listening is, I say this about every skill, but listening is probably one of my favorite things to teach, because it's so important in just general communication. And I read somewhere, this was a little while ago, but I read somewhere that adults, when they communicate, spend 45% of their time listening. And then the next number after that is speaking, which is 30%. So I'm just thinking in relevance to TOEFL, even in the writing section and the speaking section, if you can't understand what's being said in the listening parts of those, then that's a really bad, you know, really big disadvantage. It means that you're definitely going to struggle in getting a high score. So I'm going to look at some very sort of general strategies that you can use to help with listening, and combining those with a little bit of advice about note taking as well.
Fantastic. This is so needed. I know there's not a whole lot of teachers out there that you know, are excited about teaching the listening section. So I'm so happy that you're offering this to us. We look forward to your lesson. Thank you so much, Jane, for being on with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's jump into this listening mini lesson. I'm going to share my screen and show you my 3 strategies for how you can understand professors better. So in this lecture, I'm going to focus on some listening strategies that will help your understanding, but specifically when you're listening to long lectures in the listening section. But first, let's just kind of focus on the things that I mentioned in my conversation with Kirsten about why listening is important. So we have these numbers here about what happens in everyday conversation, in everyday English. So whenever you're communicating, you are spending 45% of your time listening, 30% of your time speaking, 16% of your time reading, and 9% of your time writing. So look at the proportion of listening. It's actually really, really big. And considering how all the different language skills interact with each other, as you're speaking, you're listening as well. So it really is an important skill to be confident about. And also in TOEFL, of course, you need to listen in the listening section, but if you are aiming for a high speaking score and also a high writing score, then listening is incredibly important in those sections as well. It's practically impossible to get a very high speaking score unless you can listen confidently. So it's definitely worth working on your listening skills. And then in real life, people take you a lot more seriously if you don't need to keep saying, "Excuse me, can you say that again?" You'll find that you have much greater credibility. That affects how professional you appear in job interviews or any situation where you're interacting with other people. If you need to make an impression, the better your listening is, the better you are going to appear. And with all that comes respect. So I hope I've kind of convinced you that listening is definitely a good skill to work on. So let's look at why listening is a challenge, specifically in TOEFL situations. We may find that speakers speak too quickly. We might find that we actually get bored with some topics. There may be some topics that you prefer to others. Some, when the professor starts speaking, you think, "Oh no, not this," and you start losing focus. That's also a really big problem in the listening section. Sometimes it may be that you just don't understand the content. And then, of course, in an exam situation, we've got the stress factor. And listening particularly gets affected by that. We can't double check listening. We can't ask for it to be said again so that we can make sure that we did understand it. That adds an element of stress and kind of, just into the complexity of the skills that you need for listening. Let's look at some ways that we can start to address some of these difficulties. So in this mini lesson, I'm going to talk about speaker clues. There are clues that speakers give us as they speak. And actually, once you start being able to pick up on these, you'll find that you can use them to help you understand what the speaker is saying. I'm going to look at 3 types of clues. So the first clue is word stress and emphasis. Word stress and emphasis is really the same way of saying that the speakers draw your attention to keywords and important points. It's sort of almost like they're adding a bold font into when they're speaking. And you'll notice that when speakers stress, they speak a little bit louder, a little bit clearer, and possibly even a little bit slower as they draw your attention to those important points. Now, Some professors do this really clearly and nicely. Others don't do it quite so much. So as you get used to listening for this in lectures, you'll discover that lecturers definitely do have their own styles, their own ways of doing it. But in some of the lectures, you might find that it's not quite so obvious. You might have to listen just a little bit more clearly to start really, really hearing it. But you will get it. Once you start noticing that this happens, you will begin to understand and to get it. And a really good way to practice is actually get yourself outside the TOEFL environment and start listening to interviews and chat shows. Anytime that speakers are interacting with each other is actually a really good time to listen for this. Let's look at an example in a TOEFL situation. So this is an extract of a listening lecture, and it's about it's from an astronomy class. It's about looking at chemicals that help life outside of our planet. And you can see that on this extract, I've put the keywords in bold font to help them stand out a little bit more. So I'm going to read it now and see if you can actually hear when I'm stressing those words and phrases. Taking a look out into the universe, astronomers have detected the chemical building blocks in a wide range of environments outside of our own planet. Meteorites have been found to contain two kinds of substances whose chemical structures mark them as having an extraterrestrial origin: amino acids and sugars. Amino acids are organic compounds that are molecular building blocks of proteins. Proteins are key biological molecules that provide the structure and function of the body's tissues and organs, and essentially carry out the work of the cells in your body. When we examine the gas and dust around the universe, we also find a number of organic molecules, compounds that on Earth are associated with the chemistry of life. Now, you probably know in English that actually any word in a sentence can be stressed. So it's really up to the speaker to decide what the important words are and phrases. I may have added a little extra stress in a couple of the words there. I think I did. But that's, because this is a natural process. According to the speaker in the moment, the speaker will decide what the important keywords are. As you're starting to listen to these kinds of things, you'll begin to pick it up. Let's look now at the second clue that speakers give to help you understand. And these are two sort of related things, slightly different, but related, which is why I've put them together. So, repetition and explanation. This normally happens when the professor wants to introduce an important concept. And quite often you'll hear this important concept and you'll think, oh my goodness, I don't know what that means. So the very first thing to do is not to panic. You're not required to have any previous knowledge of academic topics for TOEFL. It's that everything that you need will be given to you in the lecture. So if you hear something that you really don't know what that concept is, the first thing is just calm down. Don't panic at all. But you really should start to listen carefully and to get ready to take notes. It's probably a sign that whatever this concept is important. If the professor repeats or explains, you can be sure that this is definitely something that you should be taking note of. Let's look at some examples of this. And I've got 3 different examples here. Again, it's from the same astronomy lecture. And I've put the repeated or the explained terms in orange font to make them stand out a little bit more. So let's have a look at this first example on the list. This is actually right from the beginning of the lecture. So the professor starts off with, now make no mistake about it, studying the origin, evolution, and distribution of life in the universe is no easy task, but this is exactly what astrobiologists do. So at that point, I'm probably thinking, astrobiologists, what's that? What does that mean? But then we get an explanation. Astrobiology brings together. Then we find out that it brings together experts from these different disciplines. Okay, so now I'm getting a little bit more understanding of this. Then astrobiologist is repeated for a third time. So by that point, I'm pretty sure that this is going to be relevant to the rest of the lecture. But I've now got an understanding of what astrobiologists are because of that repetition, because of the explanation associated with it. Another way that professors will explain important points is by giving a term and then giving an explanation immediately afterwards. And this is what an example of the second sentence is. So we find a number of organic molecules, compounds that on Earth are associated with the chemistry of life. So if you get to, we find a number of organic molecules, and you're thinking, hold on, I'm not a biologist. Organic molecules, what does that mean? It's ages since I've done chemistry. I can't quite remember. You get the explanation. Compounds that on Earth are associated with the chemistry of life. So you're being given an explanation there. That's probably a clue that this is now going to be a key point in the lecture going forward. And then the final example here is when there's an explanation again. So this one starts, perhaps the most important innovation in the history of biology, apart from the origin of life itself, is the process of photosynthesis. And if you're thinking, yeah, photosynthesis, I remember studying that in school, but that was years ago. What is that? You get an explanation. The complex sequence of chemical reactions, and then the rest of the explanation. So the point with this is that if you do hear a term that you're not familiar with, or a definition, a concept rather, that you can't remember the definition for, probably just about everybody else in the listening section is feeling exactly the same thing. So listen carefully for the next few sentences, because that will probably give you an explanation of it. So that's how professors use repetition and explanation to help you, to reassure you. Let's move on to the third clue that speakers give us. These are transition words and phrases. You're probably already familiar with these terms because you probably use these in your own speaking and your own writing as well, probably. So these words and phrases are little signposts. They signal what is coming next. And a good strategy is to learn the most common ones. So the most common ones are things like where the professor wants to talk about 2 points. So the professor will say, the 2 theories associated with this subject. So as soon as you hear 2 theories, you can probably anticipate that the professor will be explaining what those 2 theories are. We've got other phrases that signify when information is being added. The professor may say, additionally, and also, and another thing. Or we have contrasting transitions. However, but, on the other hand. Now, these are probably some of the most common ones. Professors don't always use these really common expressions in their lectures. Remember that TOEFL is sort of university level, it's not high school level. So professors are a little bit more advanced in the way that they put the lectures together. And we'll look at some examples of those in just a second. But start listening out for the transition words and phrases, learn what they mean, and then really be prepared for what they are actually going to show you. So if the professor does say there are 2 different reasons why people do this, you're probably going to have to write about those two different reasons. Sometimes you may only get one reason, and that one reason will be highlighted. So the professor may say, there are two different reasons. The most important one is, and then also that gives you a clue that perhaps you are just going to be hearing about one reason. But either way, your preparation will be really helped by listening out for these particular phrases. So let's look at some examples. And here, just to change things around a little bit, I've put the transition phrases in purple font to make them stand out a bit more. So the first two examples, one issue that astrobiologists are currently researching, furthermore, the most basic life requires two special capabilities. They're quite straightforward, I think. They're in the list of commonly used expressions. The next two examples, perhaps not so, but they also give you clues about the direction that the lecture is taking. So, taking a look out into the universe, astronomers have detected. So, this maybe indicates a slight change in topic. Perhaps we've been looking at Earth up to this point in the lecture. Now we're going to focus on looking out into the universe. And then perhaps the most important innovation in the history of biology. So when a professor rather focuses on something like that, that gives you a clue that the next thing that they're going to talk about is probably a really important part of the entire lecture itself, if they're actually highlighting an innovation like that. And then the next example is really nice because this is a cause and effect example. And professors use this a lot in terms of showing the sequence of things, showing what actually happens when you do something. It's a way of explaining, but allowing you to keep up with the explanation. So we get previously, so that means that we're now talking about something that's happened before the time frame that we've usually been talking about. And then as plants went through the process of photosynthesis, they produced higher quantities of oxygen. So we've got cause and effect. Plants did photosynthesis, they produced higher quantities of oxygen. And then the second sentence, the first traces of large amounts of oxygen on Earth, enough to support species, has been estimated at about 2 billion years ago, which means that these oxygen-producing life forms existed before then. So that's another example of cause and effect, which means in the middle of the sentence. And that's really another thing. These transition words don't necessarily appear in the beginning of sentences. They're sometimes in the middle, but they're still helping you and guiding you. They're still giving you signals. And then finally, the last one. So, just to sum up, you can probably cheer when you hear that because you know that you're almost at the end of the lecture. So you can start kind of relaxing a little bit, not too much, but you can start thinking, yes, it's nearly at the end. Okay, so those were the 3 strategies that I use to help students understand lectures better. But my biggest advice for practicing listening is don't pretend. Don't think that it's going to go away. If you do need to practice listening, then practice it. It doesn't just fix itself. It doesn't get better by you thinking, oh yeah, it'll be okay. Normally it doesn't work that way. So here's what I suggest. If you have a transcript of a lecture, and if you're studying from good resources, you will have a transcript. You may have to turn to the back of the book, or you may have to go to a different part of the website, but good resources have transcripts. So use the transcript. I recommend printing it or putting it into an app like Word or Preview, because what you want to do is actually follow it as you're listening. There's been lots of research about how this is beneficial, and it really does help. It helps with understanding and interpreting. What you can also do is, like I did in my examples, annotate it. So highlight when the professor is using stress, or change the font color, use bold for stress, maybe change the font color for transition phrases, something like that. But actually use it as a working document. And don't just do this once. Listen to a lecture several times following the transcript, and that will really, really help. Now, if you don't have a transcript, there is still things that you can do with just the audio file. So you can listen just to a couple of sentences and then pause and then continue. Make sure that you understand the sentences, but breaking them up like that can really help with understanding rather than trying listening to everything at the same time. On some apps, you can actually slow down the audio, and you've got to be careful with this. It can sound a bit robotic, but if you're really struggling to understand something, just slowing it down a little bit can really help. When we speak, we merge the words together and they all get jumbled up. It sounds like there's no break between them. But by slowing down the audio, you will actually be able to identify the individual words. So that can help. The other thing, and this is something I really like suggesting, is that when you're practicing listening, use it as an opportunity to practice speaking as well. Because if you listen and then you speak what you've just heard, that actually helps your brain make connections. Language is all about connections, and that can definitely improve your understanding. And then the final thing, ask for help. If you really are struggling, there are lots and lots of people who can help you. And the whole thing about any skills building practice is that it takes time. So you really do need to keep practicing it, but it will be worth it if you practice. You'll find that you will improve. Thank you for watching. I hope you can use these strategies in your listening practice. If you'd like to work with me, then please do contact me, and good luck in your exam.